You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature webcast and podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives take an objective, nonpartisan look at topics that matter most to business leaders. In this series, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's discussion, we'll talk about sustainability, a hot topic at the heart of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. As many companies adopt new sustainability frameworks and implement new practices, executives are left to kind of figure out how these changes will impact all of their stakeholders and their bottom lines. And so why should their companies care about this? Joining me today is Bob Moritz, the global chairman of PwC International and a trustee of the Conference Board, and he's a fierce advocate for sustainability. Bob, in a recent piece you wrote for the World Economic Forum, you called climate change the most formidable challenge that we've faced since World War II. Bob, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, sustainability has been a key subject for companies for quite a while, and all of our stakeholders, our customers, our employees, and our owners. Talk about why it's so important and what companies should be thinking about today.
Steve, it's a great question in terms of what's different. First, CEOs around the world, and we've seen this with our own PwC CEO survey data, have to be engaged more so with their stakeholders, not just their investors, but their broader stakeholders, which obviously includes investors. Those stakeholders are better informed. They're more worldly as the world has become much more transparent with the use of and leveraging of social media and other technology tools to help bring the world to be smaller. So those stakeholders have a better appreciation of what's going on. They have a better appreciation of sort of how they can have an impact at the end of the day. And it goes to the UN's SDG goals when you step back and think about the broader long-term agenda for society at large. As a result, those stakeholders are making different decisions. Consumer behavior is changing. Investor behavior is changing. Business partners, banking relationships, financial services relationships, et cetera, are all changing in terms of the decision-making they need. So corporates now need to actually be much more attuned to how those changes are affecting their ability to have employees, business partners, consumers, and the like, and embed it within their strategy. As I say time and time again, there's no more daylight between strategy and ESG related topics. They're one and the same. And if you're not interdepending those things, you're actually going to miss a long-term strategic opportunity and be competitively disadvantaged if you're not paying attention to those things and doing something about them so the world, your stakeholders, actually see it, appreciate it, and you derive the benefit from it.
So Bob, when you say sustainability, I mean, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. What's the breadth of the subject as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, so when you step back, I think there's a good way to think about this. One framework is obviously the ESG agenda, environmental, social, and governance. Another one that the World Economic Forum uses, for example, is planet, people, shared prosperity, and again, good governance. All those things, I think, intertwine. But I do want to be clear, as people think about the broader topic of sustainability today, there's a focus primarily on climate. It's gotten the biggest attention, but it's not necessarily the only piece of the pie. And I would say as well, that when you think about environmental, you also go to clean air, clean water, et cetera. And oh, by the way, the E and the S become very much interdependent and intertwined with one another. So we have to think about this a little bit more holistically than just a climate agenda or a social agenda. Depending on where you are in the world, you may see a different dominance or prominence of those individual issues.
So it's climate, which includes, obviously carbon, air, it includes pollution, water, how we're using our natural resources in a sustainable way, meaning we don't use them up and spoil this one globe that we have to live in, all of those things, but also how we interact with our employees and our people, right? I think that's what I hear you saying.
Absolutely. And it has to go to every organizational element of a business and every business enabling aspect of that. What I mean is your consumers, your employees, your investors, the traditional groups, but you also have to go to your insurers, your bankers, your business partners, your joint business relationships that you have. Because what we see as well over the trend over the last decade or so is a lot more organizations can't do all these things that they need to do by themselves. They're part of a bigger ecosystem. And as that ecosystem evolves, then these organizations have to actually interconnect with one another more so than ever before. And this is where the broader ESG agenda, sustainability agenda comes into play, because everybody's got a role to play in this area.
Yeah, that's great. So, in the sustainability world, there's been some big changes. Probably not everybody is familiar with some of the wonkiness here, but just last November, just a few months ago, the IFRS Foundation announced the International Sustainability Standards Board. This was a big deal because it consolidated the Climate Disclosure Standard Board and the Value Reporting Foundation. So, probably people aren't familiar. These aren't household terms, but these are big groups that are important to the sustainability world. And you came out very publicly and applauded this consolidation. And I just wanted you to say a few things about why this consolidation is important and what it means and how companies should be viewing the work of this group.
Yeah, great question. So let me just provide a little bit more context before I get to the specifics of your question. First, those stakeholders are asking for better information so they can make better decisions and perhaps change how they behave, how they interact, and what they ultimately do with their time, their money, their capital, etc. In order to have that information, they need a common set of standards. And the reason they need that is to actually have something they are comfortable with to measure the progress, understand the progress an organization's making in these areas, and equally as important, compare one institution versus another. Let me make it really simple. A potential employee coming out of university today has some different choices on employment, which obviously employment is very tight these days, and there's lots of choices. You think about the great resignation or great reshuffle is the way I think about it. Organizationally, people are looking at those companies and saying, okay, whose values are aligned with mine? Who do I want to join? An element of that decision is now in comparing one company to another. How are they doing on diversity and inclusion? How are they doing on pay equity? How are they doing on supply chains relevant to the climate? How are they doing in managing for clean water, et cetera? So they want to see progress and comparability. Now, up until this point in time, we really didn't have a lot of global standards, quality standards to measure this stuff in a common way to allow for that comparability and to demonstrate progress. So this was a first of hopefully many steps that bring that together. Because prior to that, Steve, there was an alphabet soup of organizations that actually were doing little bits and pieces of this, but no commonality amongst them. And as a result, the efforts that you described in your opening question very much start to take and move forward the consolidation of getting to good quality standards that organizations can report on so the stakeholders can use that information to make the judgment calls they need to make.
Yeah, and this should make it a lot easier for organizations because it's a framework or an outline or a set of metrics, as you said, that all companies can use and then all stakeholders can use to compare and track. It just makes the conversations easier and you're not mixing and matching. So much time was wasted in debating what this subject meant or what that metric meant. So it actually is eased the conversation and the tracking of performance.
Absolutely. And the other thing it does, to be fair, is it actually gets capital, financial capital, and for that matter, human capital, to the places that are making progress. Investors are making choices now in terms of who is actually making progress. And oh, by the way, they're placing their bets. There's going to be a longer, higher rate of return in those companies that are making a difference. If you accelerate that investment of capital, financial and human, that actually accelerates the change curve. So by having more transparency, you get better allocation of that capital. You also get better results faster and get the speed of adoption and the scale of adoption to deal with these issues much faster than ever before.
Yeah, and if you're in the energy industry, you're producing oil, for instance, you're going to be different than, in a knowledge-based industry that doesn't deal with that natural resource. So the framework also lets people, sort of compare within peer sets or like companies so that there is, an easier comparison, because otherwise you got apples and oranges.
Very much so. And when you look at this, again, I'll go to the investing side of the equation for a second. The asset managers there today, the institutional investors, et cetera, are all looking for better data in a more consistent framework rather than having to regurgitate all the data and try to do the analysis in terms of what decisions they are making. And we're starting to see that come to life more. So they're actually ones that are pushing for this faster and faster and in more scale and more so around the world. And that's where it's interesting because you see progress with rules and regulations evolving too. The EU has put out some rules. The SEC in the US has put out some rules now. So you're starting to see a buildup and a speed up of the momentum around this reporting area, which has a combination of effects that benefits the stakeholders, but also accelerates that change curve sector by sector and across the world, across countries and the like for the benefit of the world.
So we've talked about these multi-stakeholders, customers, employees, owners. I used to remember it by my title, CEO, customers, employees, owners, but also community and environment. How do you, as you think about advising companies, how do you approach the balance? Because, what may be the best approach for one stakeholder may not be so good for another. How do you make sure you optimize everything?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. And I'm going to argue this is probably one of the more difficult leadership challenges going forward. First and foremost, what we say to CEOs and their management teams and their governance bodies is make sure that you are embedding all of this into strategy so it's not bolt-on. That's step number one. If it's a bolt-on, Kenley, it's not going to be taken seriously and it's not going to be part of the management incentives that ultimately an organization has to deal with. Point number two is you have to engage more transparently with your stakeholders. You've got to communicate, but it's not just one-way communication. It's actually got to be two-way communication. You've got to listen carefully to what your stakeholders are expecting, as well as respond to say, how am I actually taking the action to respond to their needs, their expectations, and the like? And some of that is early stage discussion. Others may be choices you see in the decisions they make. If consumers truly are not getting what they need, they're going to start walking away. You'll have erosion of revenue, you'll have erosion of margin because the cost of sale will become so much bigger in terms of what needs to happen. So that constant communication is going to be really important. And here, Steve, is the challenge, which is not only describe what you're doing, but why you're doing it. Because you are making trade-offs all the time. And this is the point that a lot of people are finally catching on to, which is what is a just transition? To blow up the dependency on oil, for example, and go to zero in terms of emissions from that particular sector makes no sense when you think about what I'll call the downstream implications of be. Energy prices spike, people are out of work, you'll have tremendous concerns in the communities where you lose GDP. So a just transition over time in terms of how are you managing year to year, quarter to quarter, and decreasing and making that progress is super important. You've got to explain that goal over a long term. You've got to explain the progress you're making and those choices that you make. And that's where the engagement with governance bodies, boards, and those stakeholders becomes super important. So build in a strategy, communicate, and then manage accordingly.
And then describe why these goals are the right thing within your business strategy, because that all brings it, that's the full circle that you talked about, the connecting with the strategy.
Yeah, there's two elements here. One is first, as you think about what I'll call the financial implications, right? A company that has significant climate emissions will have to spend a lot of money in terms of what to do differently with their supply chain, or long-dated assets or manufacturing sites that maybe not long-term in nature as you think about the change. There's a financial aspect to that the investor group in particular will be interested in. But the non-financial information is equally important to those consumers, those banks, that insurance company, and yes, investors as well, because eventually you'll get convergence of time horizons here. And that's why it's so important to think about both of those things in terms of what's material for you and what's material for your stakeholders in both categories.
So we've talked about some great background on why sustainability is so important for companies and their multi-stakeholders. Next, we're going to talk about how the current events like the war in Ukraine is impacting global sustainability efforts. I'm going to take a short break and be right back.
If you're enjoying this podcast and are interested in embedding sustainability into your corporate DNA, join us for our Sustainability Summit on July 14th and 15th at the Westin Hotel in New York's Times Square. You'll hear from some of our country's top ESG executives on how they integrate sustainability into their business strategy and operations. At the 2022 summit, You and your C-suite colleagues can take advantage of this historic opportunity to learn what the ideal ESG performer looks like, how reporting and rating systems are evolving, and how to make sustainability everyone's job. You'll also discover how to put purpose in profit and how to tell your sustainability story to consumers, investors, and the public. You can find out more about this in-person event coming to New York on July 14th and 15th at www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by our trustee of the Conference Board and the global chairman of PwC International, Bob Moritz. Bob, the war in Ukraine has created a global energy shortage, and I think people are starting to look at energy around the world in a different light right now. Prices are skyrocketing. There are shortages. People are not worried that as we go into next fall and winter, they're not going to have enough heating oil. What should countries be doing in the short run to deal with these energy needs, juxtaposed against our long-term net zero goals?
Yeah, so first and foremost, Steve, let's be very clear. What's happening with Ukraine and with the Russian war is a travesty. And again, we all want it to stop, and we all will have to deal with the detrimental effects that came out of this over the next decade plus, no matter when this war stops. And we hope that the humanitarian aspect becomes equally important as people think about this issue on hand right now. But let's go to your issue on energy and the like. And there's a trifecta of challenges that countries have to deal with. It is the combination of affordability in terms of protecting its citizens. It's the combination of security and supply of that energy. And it is the combination of economic and long-term sustainability as you think about sort of the climate and all the effects it has. And this is where each country has to look carefully at what is the most important issues when you think about those three framing items. And what levers of change do you actually have to take into consideration? In some countries, you're a net intaker, right? You're a net importer in terms of that energy price. So your question is, how do I get a supply? And how do I negotiate with other countries now to have access to that supply? And perhaps how do I manage the affordability? Because, oh, by the way, prices are going up, and you've already seen that. And that further confounds the inflationary effects. If I'm a net producer, I'm actually in a beneficial area right now if I manage that correctly, both in terms of taking care of my own people, but supplying energy to the rest of the world. But now I want to do it in a cleaner way. So each country has to look at those three framing items and then say, what do I need to do specifically over the next 3 to 5 years as you look at what I'll call this horizon, and then also plant the seeds for the next decades to come.
Yeah, so you've got a situation where countries were trying to move away from coal, for example, in their energy production, and move towards clean sources. But now you have a whole disruption of the global supply chain. And countries are saying, and companies are saying, is it okay to go back and use a little coal so we don't have people, run out of electricity, or, in food production, that people don't starve? So, there are some things where sometimes, I think of it as the game of soccer. First time I watched a game of soccer and I saw someone kick the ball backwards, I said, what are they doing? The goal's the other way, but sometimes you have to back up and reset. Is that kind of what we're experiencing now globally?
Yeah, this goes back to my earlier comments about companies and how they manage stakeholder expectations. You're actually going to have to do that at a country level too, right? In terms of how do I manage the expectations of, my citizens who are voting in some parts of the world, in other cases, maybe not so lucky to have that democratic process, but managing that just transition in terms of what's real as I think about the needs of my citizens becomes extremely important in this process. In some cases, we want to accelerate the change curve going forward, depending on the country you're in. In other cases, you actually may have to pause and say, you know what? Our ambitions was a little too fast. And when I combine the war and the effects of that war coupled with inflation right now, I may have to readjust my expectations and what I do from a policy perspective, an economic perspective, and manage the expectations of my citizens in a much more transparent way. And likewise, Steve, I'll just pivot for a second. The companies will need to do the same. The two things that companies need to do as you think about energy prices is to, yes, definitely diversify your supply and ultimately your programs relevant to budget processes and the like. And what also organizations are going to have to do here is be much more thoughtful about scenario plans and dealing with spikes up and down, You're going to have to be much more diligent in making faster decisions. We think agility is going to be more important because you can't predict the future that we see in front of us right now with a degree of certainty. So getting agility and speed in decision making and then scaling them quickly and adjusting accordingly is going to be key for our management team to be successful. I'm going to argue the same is true for the governments as well.
Yeah, agility may be the word of 2022, as you try
and
to do
well
that.
Beyond.
Well, but these supply chains are not that agile. I mean, they're pretty fixed. And you see that, when these enormous capital installations with energy producing plants, you can't really move a mine and those kinds of things. So it's not as easy. It's easier for people to be thinking about, how do I pivot to alternate sources and so forth. But at a country level, it's not easy, is it?
It's not. And this is where the combination of all three becomes super important. If you look at a country like India, for example, they actually could take advantage of this opportunity if, in fact, they are moving faster to get scalability, pricing right, as we come back to that concept of affordability, and bring an element of ESG into what they do, because companies will want those cleaner, secure, more affordable supplies. The second thing, though, is to think about the downstream effects. Let me give you a real example. Everybody's focused either on energy or I'll call it semiconductor chips, right? So those are the two big things that are top of mind. Well, let's remember that the chips don't happen without the ceramics. The ceramics don't happen without the energy to fuel those plants to actually create those. So thinking about all aspects of your supply chain and peeling back the onion multiple times at a company level and at a country level becomes really important as you think about the dependencies, so you're not surprised or shocked by some of the effects that may be coming.
We've had kind of three global shocks, and some are a little more local, but in the last 2 years, I mean, we used to call them black swan events, which used to be lifetime events, but now we have them. So, you had COVID, you had the social justice issues, and then, now we have the war in Ukraine, all of which have had a surprisingly global effect, whereas in past history, they may not have been this widespread. And that's partially because we're more interconnected as a world. So as I think about this, it does raise the question of how do you, we have a decades long goal of getting to net zero, of getting to a carbon-free environment. And, nations throttled back, on carbon-based production because they wanted to advance the renewables. Maybe they got ahead of themselves, right ahead of some of these big events. But where are we as you look at renewables generally, which typically are solar and wind, some waste, and then you have to also think about nuclear in the mix. But where are we with renewables, and where should we be?
Yeah, so you clearly see the revival of interest in those areas, be it wind, solar, nuclear, or otherwise. But let's also recognize that renewables is still, unfortunately, a relatively small aspect of our energy dependency. Let's just take electricity as an example. Today, that's a little bit more of 20% comes out of what I'll call the renewables and supplying our electric grid supply chain, so to speak. So we've got a long way to go in terms of the process. I will say that we see a lot of great pilots, projects, and initiatives to increase the speed and scale of renewables, which is great. The challenge that the world sees, though, actually, Steve, is how do I get those projects more scaled more quickly? And many of them need investment. Now, what is interesting is you peel back that onion, actually the world does have plenty of investment capability right now. Now, again, that may be impacted somewhat and slowed somewhat as you look at the economic pressures that we're heading into. But the issue is not so much, do we have capital? It's how do I get capital to those projects to get them speed and scalability? And that's where we got to do a better job of these ideas, these initiatives, and these projects, making a business case to attract the capital that's, again, financial and human, to actually get scalability into the mix. And the issue is not so much the asset side, it's actually the matching of those, which becomes extremely important. And that's where the business community and governments right now are spending time. How do we get the match game, so to speak, better equipped to actually get scale, speed, and ultimately benefit and impact at the table right now? So renewables is one part of that. The second is actually adaptability. The third is actually mitigation. So carbon capture is another great example of those things. So all three, adaptability, mitigation, as you think about going to net zero, and what I'll call reduction and going to a positive aspect of carbon capture is equally as important in this mix as we look ahead.
Yeah, and as I think about any one company or even one industry, the investments required to really move the dial are just, inconceivable. You can't do it. As I think about it, imagine if you could take solar panels and shrink them to, where you could put one on the roof of every house and run that household independently, or put one on top of every car and recharge the battery. But we're not there. It's bankrupted many a company trying to do the R&D on this. So same thing with wind and same thing with storage, battery storage. So, there is a role I think for policy to play here in public-private partnerships. How do you see all of that working?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll go to one particular group called the Sustainability Markets Initiative. It's a great example of this, where they brought sector leaders together to do three things. One is to say, what can we do as a sector to speed up that scale and incent the behavioral change that you talked about? Second is, what can we do to actually get the financial aspects embedded in that as you bring finance and technology to those innovations and change programs? And third, what can you do from a policy perspective, country by country, to help enable the success to happen? And can we feed that into the upcoming G7 and G20 meetings as we look ahead? And there is changes to the banking system in terms of how they assess risk and how much capital they need against those assets. Are they clean assets or dirty assets? Then on the other side, are we actually sharing IP as quickly as we possibly can? When you think about those great ideas that should be more scalable and leverageable. So there's policy decisions to be made. There's sector initiatives that could be dealt with. And then also there's an element of how do we continue to educate the consumer as well, so they understand how they can have the impact in the most beneficial way going forward. And that's where sector leadership, business leadership is really stepping up with government. So we've got public-private partnerships taking on these couple issues. I'll add one third piece, Steve, which we haven't talked about. As you look at these challenges, the more we can get youth, the next generational leadership engaged in the solutions, the better off, so they can actually help us, I'll call it the old timers, really drive a faster agenda that's beneficial to them, not necessarily just the world we're living in today.
I heard that mentioned in 1970 in April on the very first Earth Day. We need to get youth involved. And I remember participating in those days. I think that's going to be a consistent thing. Hey, you mentioned the World Economic Forum, Bob, and PwC recently developed a joint report to assess the impacts of international carbon pricing. You may want to share, some of the conclusions from that report and some of your recommendations.
Yeah, happy to. So first off, the concept of a carbon price or a carbon market is not necessarily new. Some countries have that today, and various companies are trying to implement stuff inside their own organizations. Having said that, what we don't have is a global carbon market or global carbon price initiative and mechanism to actually make this come to life. The study we did basically proved out three things. One is, if you put a global system in place, we actually think you can accelerate the change curve in terms of reductions of emission by another 13%. And you need that because we haven't moved fast enough in the last decade to make the progress we need to relevant to the 1.5 initiative. So we do think carbon pricing or a carbon market is beneficial to the change that we're looking for. Second finding was the fact that there is no material negative impact on GDP. In fact, it's fairly neutral, perhaps maybe a 1% change in terms of the detriment. Having said that, the third aspect is in actually the offset would come in what I'll call less climate failures or tragedies, less flooding, less drought, et cetera. And by having all of those other environmental factors, you actually get a netted GDP boost as opposed to a detriment by having this mechanism in place. Now, the recommendation is, how do you actually make that come to life? And that's where we have said the efforts of the OECD, for example, on taxation and other aspects like that of getting things globally done, we would suggest that that's the mechanism, by analogy, to actually drive something like that going forward. And we're hoping to gain momentum in that regard because I think it's needed. And ultimately, I think it's going to have benefits, Steve, as you look at what we're doing in the climate space.
Yeah, it is the one place where globalization would really help, a global trading mechanism and more international cooperation. Bob Moritz, thanks so much for joining us today.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights into the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, human capital, marketing and communications, ESG, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with everybody you know. I know that they'll want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, your source of trusted insights for what's ahead. For more on the subject of sustainability and how to integrate it into your business strategy and operations, join us for our Sustainability Summit on July 14th and 15th at the Westin Hotel in New York's Times Square. This in-person event will gather some of the nation's leading executives in the ESG space for a look at what's ahead. You can find more at www.conference-board.org.